didn't get a chance to do a sound check or anything. Yeah. It works. Maybe I should go up here.
It's an F-15.
F-15, just fly by. Well, thank you for just the privilege to be with you today. Thanks for the Mountain Dew that's partially empty. Not a Mountain Dew guy. I'm just going to put that right on the keyboard where I'm sure the piano guy's freaking out. Well, let me introduce you. By the way, my introduction to the Navigators was in 1990 when I went to meet this pastor for lunch who had just led me to the Lord 2 years previous. And when I went to meet him, he stood me up for lunch. And then on the church steps, I ran into this other guy who was also meeting him for lunch, and he stood him up as well. And the other guy was a navigator. So we literally met on the church steps there. And then he and I went out and got a Coke. And first time I ever met this guy, we're just hanging out. This is back in Florida. And it's already hot down there in Florida, out on this baseball field that we're hanging out at. And I mentioned to him I'm dating this girl. And he said, "Hey brother, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Is this relationship pure?" I had never had anybody ask me a question like that in the church for 2 years. I was just used to, "How you doing, brother? God bless you. How you doing?" "Doing great." That was the only thing I ever heard in my church experience as a young Christian. So I said, "It's not." And he said, "Well, you say you're a Christian, but you don't really live like one, do you?" Wow, that was my introduction. I like to call it the uppercut discipleship approach there. Going for the juggler is the other name for that. But I tell you, my wife today of 25 years is very thankful that he came along and challenged me, because I would not be with her. I'll tell you that. So I'm forever grateful for somebody who was willing to come alongside me and walk a journey with me, as I'm sure many of you have experienced in your life or you're doing with others. Well, I want to introduce you to our founder, Dawson Trotman, and maybe tell you a few stories you haven't heard. That's little Dawes sitting on the porch there with his family. They are from Bisbee, Arizona. Anybody from Bisbee, Arizona in here today? 1906 is when he was born. That's his dad, Charles, his mom, Mildred, his sister, Mildred, and his brother, Roland. All right, let's roll to the next slide. Thank you. Dawson, growing up, was a bit of a troublemaker. Any troublemakers in here today? Thank you for those hands. Thank you. Well, growing up, he figured out how to steal some coins out of his mom's coin jar that was sitting in the kitchen windowsill. And first dime he stole, he took it to a little dime store and bought 10 chocolates with that dime and went behind a tree and ate every one of those chocolates and got sick as a dog, and concluded that because he stole that coin from Mama, that's why he got so sick. Well, he continued to take those coins, and that little trait that went with them, just being sneaky, tricky, went through him through life. And as he got older, he became quite a liar, and he had quite the stories to tell. And his sister would always notice these stories would just kind of change over time. And so by the time he hit high school, he was the class valedictorian. He was the captain of the basketball team. Very popular guy, well known. He actually gave a talk about morals and ethics at a high school presentation, and no one knew that he was helping himself to the school yearbook fund. So he also happened to be the editor of the student newspaper at his school. This is all, by the way, he grew up in Bisbee as a kid, and at 7 they moved to Southern California area, Long Beach, LA area. Lomita is the exact suburb. Well, when he graduated high school, he had never touched a lick of liquor until that night and just got plastered. And he was just lost and aimless and looking for something. He looked to the girls to try and find it with the girls, couldn't find it with the girls. And I've jumped ahead of myself just a little bit. I'm going to back up just for a moment and tell you that at 14, he wandered into a church. He said a prayer at this church. And then later on, he listened to a preacher give a presentation to accept Jesus. He pulled out a gold watch and said, "Does anybody want this gold watch?" And Dawson shot up and went running to the front because he wanted that gold watch, but he was actually using that as an illustration to share Christ. So Dawson ended up praying a second prayer, didn't get the watch. Well, these prayers were really just things that were said, not really taken to heart. So by the time he's 20, you heard me say that he graduated high school. He's lost, he's frustrated, and he just decides, I know I've done this church thing a little bit, and he became a gambler, a pool shark, a drinker. He just kind of decided, you know what, I'm just going to dive in and just do all this stuff. So that's what he did. So for a couple of years, actually 3 to be exact, he just kind of did everything he could. And after his third arrest, at the age of 20, he was trying to find his car. He was at an amusement park and he was wasted trying to find his car, and this police officer runs into him at this amusement park area, and he took his keys from him and said, "You're not getting in that car." He's like, "Do you like the way you're living your life?" And he said, "Sir, I hate it." So the officer said, "I'm not giving you these keys back till you get sobered up." So Dawson's sitting on this bench, and somehow his mom had heard that he had gotten arrested, and she had been praying for him for a long time and had some friends praying for him. And she was concerned about her son. And what's interesting is when she told this friend about Dawes and his arrest, the friend actually stayed up praying for him all night long. And God gave a vision to this friend of Dawson with a Bible, and he's teaching amongst the masses. And she calls Dawson's mom and says, "It's okay. He's going to be okay. I've got peace about it." So they just kind of gave it to the Lord. Well, he's 20 years old, and he's got 2 friends that are trying to do this Sunday school attendance competition, and one friend's a guy and one friend's a girl, and they're both trying to recruit him to this Sunday school class to help them win this competition. So she won, he got the shaft, and he goes into this Sunday school class. Well, there's all these young people in there, and the 2 ladies leading the class, Miss Thomas, Mrs. Mills, they had the scripture memory contest. Now Dawson was just there to help him, get the attendance record thing, but he ended up joining this team, and the 2 ladies had thrown out a 10-verse scripture memory challenge. And to help the team out, Dawson decides he's going to go home and memorize every one of those verses, because every verse he memorizes, that's 5 points for the team. Well, he goes home, memorizes these 10 verses, comes back the next Sunday. He's the only one who's memorized the verses. Well, the two ladies leading the class were really excited because the first 10 verses all had to do with the gospel. So they threw out another 10-verse challenge. He goes home, memorizes another 10, which is on Christian living. He goes home, memorizes another 10, comes back the next Sunday. There's one challenger who's memorized one verse to Dawson's 20. So his team won the competition. Well, at this time, Dawson is a truck driver at a lumber yard. And he's on the way to work with his lunch pail. And one of those verses he memorized in that silly scripture memory contest pops in his head. And it was John 5:24. I tell you the truth, whoever hears my words and believes in him who sent me has eternal life. He will not be condemned. He's crossed over from death to life. So that verse pops in his head. He's like, wow. Of course, he memorized it in the King James. He said, wow, everlasting life. I like the sound of that. And he said, Lord, whatever it means to have that, I want to have that right now. And that was the first prayer Dawson had prayed that was not an SOS, get me out of this situation. One high school story I forgot to tell you about was he and a girl were swimming across this lake, and she began to drown. And in his attempts to try and save her, she's pulling him down under. So they're not going to make it to the other side. And he says, Lord, if you get me out of this, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And all of a sudden, his friends come by in a boat and get the two of them out of this lake. That was in high school. So this time he prays, whatever this everlasting life is, Lord, I want it. So as soon as he said that, John 1:12 popped in his mind. Another verse he had memorized in that silly scripture memory contest. To those who receive him, to those who believe in his name, shall become children of God. So that sealed the deal for Dawes. And he gets to the lumberyard, and everything's just going on as normal. And he had this experience with God. Well, he decides he wants to learn about God, so he decides to pick up a New Testament, and he decides to bring it to the lumberyard and just pull it out and maybe just let the guys see what he's reading. So he does that the next week, and then the second week, there's this preacher that would show up preaching to the guys at the lumberyard during the lunch hour, and the guys would always kind of move on to the far edge of the grounds to get away from what the preacher was saying. So he'd just kind of be over there spouting off whatever he's saying. Well, Dawson kind of felt bad for the guy, so he kind of made his way over and told him about this experience he had with God. And the preacher guy says, great, next week, I'd like you to share your testimony with all these guys. He's like, what? So the following week, the word got around. And by the way, Dawson's nickname, because of his hair color, was Porky. He had a color hair that you'd also see on a brush that was used to, I guess, brush pigs or something like that. Well, the word got around that Pork's going to preach. And would you believe the following week when he got to work, there's 200 guys waiting to hear what he had to say. Wow. So Dawson shared this experience he had with God. He finished his testimony. Nobody came up to him, high-fived him. Nobody clapped. No Nobody gave him a pat on the back. And a couple weeks later, a guy approached him and said, I was thinking about what you were sharing, and I want to let you know I prayed to receive Christ. And that was Dawson's first experience sharing Christ with someone. Well, could you advance one photo for me here? So his new journey's begun. Well, I in the midst of my storytelling, I wanted to share this story with you about a little girl who was just skipping to school one day. She's 9 years old, and this Model T Ford out of nowhere comes down the road, and there's nobody behind the wheel, and there's a prankster in the back seat with his feet on the steering wheel, and these two guys are just hamming it up. And while this little girl is skipping along, this guy that's got his feet on the wheel throws out a watermelon, and that thing explodes right in front of this poor little 9-year-old girl. And she just has watermelon guts and juice all over her. She goes running home to Mama. Mom's terrified. She's like, oh my gosh, she thought it was blood, so she calls Dad, and Dad comes home from work, and he's livid, and then she discovered it was watermelon and not blood. Well, Dad got her in the car, and they're like, we're gonna go find who did this. Well, they never did find who did that, but next slide, please. It was Dawson. It was him back up there in the middle, back in his BC days, before Christ. Well, what's interesting is, after he had been a Christian for almost 2 years, his Sunday school teachers, Mrs. Mills, Mrs. Thomas, said, hey, we need you to take over this Sunday school class that's these boys have run off all the previous teachers. Maybe you can help them out. So Dawson gets in there, there's these 6 boys, and they don't listen to a thing he has to say. And he's like, wow, this is a tough crowd. And he says, Lord, would you give me an idea? Would you give me an idea how to reach these boys? So the Lord gave him an idea in the book of Mark, and how the story about the seed being sown. And he's sharing that with these boys, and he's like, you guys are doing such a great job of stirring things up and distracting everybody. The enemy doesn't even have to do anything because you're already doing it for him. So the boys are kind of startled when he said that. Well, they took a lot of interest in what Dawes had to say next. And that little Sunday school class began to grow and grow and grow. Eventually, from 6 to 220 boys were a part of that Sunday school class. All right, next photo. Well, this is Dawson's future wife, Lila. You heard that story about her as a 9-year-old with watermelon all over her. Well, she grew up, and these two met because Dawson was taking these young people to a fun night, and he would offer to drive these guys and gals, and so he met Lila on one of those drives, and they struck up a conversation, and they later fell in love. Next slide. And they got married. So this is Dawes and Lila, and looks like some kind of maybe fruit bush. I'm not sure what's going on there, but they got their wedding cake they're holding. Next slide, please. Now this is a fascinating photo. I came across this in our archives, and the book Dawes, I highly recommend if you haven't read it. Just gives a great deep dive into Dawson's life. But Dawson and a buddy of his would go up in the hills of California, in Lomita. And and they spent time in the scriptures together, and they come across these passages, and they would just say, they would come across a passage like Jeremiah 33:3. Call to me, and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. So Dawson and his friend just started praying this verse for themselves, asking God to do that. They came across Ephesians 3:20, which is a verse I would hear Jim pray a lot. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. Well, they would ask God. They would ask God for these boys, that they would be able to reach more and more boys, and they pray for their city. They started praying for their states. They started praying for the country. They started praying for the world up on that hillside. And I just thought this was a fascinating photo because it looks like a young Dawson and Lila just remembering this place where God met Dawes and his buddy and started answering these prayers. And let me tell you, he spent a lot of time in the hills praying. He took literally the scriptures, how Jesus got up early, and he would get up there with his buddy at 4 or 5 in the morning and just pray for a couple hours. Just praying for God to do things. Next slide, please. So it all started with these young boys, and he had all kind of things going on, and at one point he ended up taking a semester of Bible college, and in that Bible college he met a woman who would introduce us to what we would call our first navigator. Next slide. Les Spencer. So this woman, she and her mom had a ministry in their home where mom would cook and the daughter would lead these Bible studies. And they got sailors all in the living room eating spaghetti. And she's just preaching the word to these guys, sharing the gospel with these guys. So Les Spencer was sitting on the floor eating spaghetti, and he was just soaking it all in and really hungry. And he was getting transferred to Long Beach. So this gal put him in touch with Dawes and said, this guy can help you. So when he gets down there, so this is 1933, this is 90 years ago. Les gets down there, and he gets this telegram from Dawes that says, meet me on the pier, 3 o'clock, D. Trotman. So Les goes to meet this guy. He gets to the pier. Dawson picks him up, takes him home, and there's a passage in Isaiah that illustrates what's going on here. When Dawson and Lila got married, they claimed Isaiah 60:11 for their home, which says, your gates will always stand open. They will never be shut day or night, so that men may bring you the wealth of the nations, their kings led in triumphal procession. So they would just open their home to all these sailors. So here comes Les Spencer, navigator number 1. And they go home, and Lila made this famous fried chicken dinner. Any famous fried chicken dinner lovers in here today? Well, I wish I could have tried a piece of that, but Les and Dawes enjoyed a meal and then went up in the hills of California to get in the scriptures together in his car. And they parked in Lover's Lane. And they're just in the scriptures together, and there's a knock on the window, and Dawson looks, and there's a police officer. So Dawson rolls down the window, and the officer says, all right, boys, where's the bottle? Thinking they were drinking. He's like, officer, we don't have a bottle, but we got a Bible. He said, if you turn on the lights over there at that school, I'll prove it to you. So the officer goes and turns on these lights. Dawson brings the scriptures and begins to share the gospel with this officer? Well, the officer had questions. And every time he had a question, Dawson had a verse for him. He knew right where to go. So Les is sitting there watching Dawes work with this officer, going back and forth in the scriptures. And Les had never seen anybody have such a handle on the Word of God like he saw with Dawes. So when they, within a little time, the officer prays to receive Christ, and Dawes and Les get back in the car, and Les says something that's kind of famous in our Navigator history. And he says to Dawes, I give my right arm to do what you did with that police officer tonight. And Dawson said, no, you won't. He said, yeah, I would. He said, no, you won't. He said, I told you I would. He said, Les, it won't cost you your right arm, but it'll cost you something. So Les was the first guy Dawson began to get in the scriptures with. He began praying with them. He began helping them share his faith with the guys back on the battleship that he served on, the USS West Virginia. He helped them understand the significance of fellowship with Christ and with one another. And in the midst of all that, keeping Christ the center of your life, which you might see illustrated on the wheel down here. Well, Les goes to the ship, and let's go to the next slide. He's trying to find someone to help, and he's praying, and he's discouraged. And Dawson said, listen, man, you just pray for one. Just ask God to give you a man after your own heart. So a couple months later, this guy comes along, Gurney Harris. So he decides to bring Gurney to Dawes. And he says, Dawes, teach Gurney everything you've been teaching me. And Dawes said, you teach him. And Les is like, I'm not a teacher. I can't help Gurney. And Dawson says, listen, if you can't help Gurney, then I failed as a teacher. We need to go back to square one. Well, Les didn't want to do that. So he started helping Gurney, doing with Gurney the same things Dawson was doing with him. Next slide. Well, Gurney reached this guy, Ed Goodrick. And if you've ever owned an NIV Bible and looked at a concordance on something that you were studying, maybe something on heaven or something on being hot-tempered, you can thank Ed because he wrote the concordance for the NIV. All right, next slide. And then there's John Diedrich. So Ed reaches John, and we can thank John for the name the Navigators, because at this time the Navigators were called the Servicemen's Bible Club. Yeah. Well, one day as Dawes was spending some time with John, his hobby was celestial navigation, so he'd use these instruments to study the stars. And as Dawson was watching them plotting these courses and these maps, he thought, that's what I do with guys. I help guys navigate from earth to heaven. So the term the Navigators got coined. I had a Navigator shirt on at Starbucks the other day, and as I'm at the register, the gal says, the Navigators, who's that? I said, well, we started in World War II with some guys in the military, and I said, we just help people navigate from earth to heaven using the Bible. She's like, wow. She's like, well, my husband's military, and I sure appreciate what you guys are doing. She's like, if you guys want to have any kind of a Bible study here, coffee's on me.
All right.
So that's John. So then John reaches the next slide, Virgil Hook. Virgil just had a great attitude on the ship, mop on the deck, whistling a tune. He'd be hauling frozen beef in the lockers, this heavy frozen beef. Always had a great attitude. So he ended up reaching this guy, Jim Downing. Next slide. Navigator number 6. Now Jim was, he's got quite a story because his mom had given him a Bible when he got on the battleship, the USS West Virginia, and he decided that that's where he's going to put his money, was in the Bible. And he put it up on a little shelf, and he was a postmaster on the ship, and he put it on the shelf, and he figured nobody would be looking in there, and the money was safe. So one day, he went to grab some money out of that Bible. When he's putting it back on the shelf, Virgil Hook's like, there's a better purpose for that Bible than just using it as a safe. And what's funny is Virgil had a black eye when he's telling Jim this story. And Jim's like, well, if you'd stay out of those bars, you wouldn't have a black eye. And Virgil's like, well, he's like, I didn't get this in a bar. He's like, I'm a Christian. So it started this conversation. Well, Virgil ends up bringing Jim to meet the guys, and they're going to hear Dawes speak at his apartment. So they go to his place, and Dawes leads the guys in this loud gospel singing, and they're just going to town. Well, there's a knock on the door, and it's the neighbor downstairs telling them to knock off the noise or they're going to call the police. So Dawes encouraged everybody to keep singing, just exercise your First Amendment rights. And next knock was the police. So Jim's like, I got to get out of here, because he had aspirations to become president of the United States. And he's like, I got to get away from these Navigators. So he made Dawes take him back to the pier where he slept on a park bench to get away from the Navs. Well, it took the guys a while to get Jim to come back and meet Dawes again. But eventually he went. And this time when he went, they moved out of the apartment. They're in a home. And when Dawson was speaking, Jim just remembers like one thing he spoke about, and it was this word iniquities, which he just thought sounded really funny. And while Dawson's speaking, his son Bruce is crawling around on the floor, little baby. And as he's crawling around, he kind of pulls himself up on a windowsill, and he grabs something from the windowsill, put it in his mouth, started crawling around again. So while Dawson's speaking, he notices at some point there's a lot of drool coming out of the son's mouth. So he picks up his son, he opens his mouth, and pulls out a double-edged razor blade. Looks in his son's mouth. There's no blood, no cuts. So Jim can't believe what he had just seen, and leaves the house that night and says there must be a God, because he's obviously protecting this family. Wow. Next slide, please. Next slide, one more. So Jim goes back to his battleship. He served in the 2nd gunner turret, the higher one up here on the right. He goes back to the 2nd gunner turret, and he gives his life to Christ that night. Let's go back to the previous photo. So 6 guys, and that was the beginnings of the Navigators on the USS West Virginia. Go back to thank you. So for those who don't know, the battleship is the length of 2 football fields. It's too wide to fit in a stadium, so you'd have to take out some of the bleachers to get it in there. But Jim said this was a great laboratory experiment where you got 1,200 guys living together, eating together, sleeping together, doing life together. And it was a great laboratory experiment where they were on display 24/7. Guys were watching them, how they're living, how they're treating one another. So eventually, over time, this battleship got nicknamed the Floating Seminary, because there were so many Bible studies going on that ship. Over 100 men came to Christ through those 6 before it was sunk at Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. I'm going to tell you in a moment some stories about December 7th, 1941, but Show me the next slide, please. Yeah, so here's some more early navigators here. Next slide. So I'm going to come back to December 7th, but I want to tell you a few other stories before I do. So the Navs got started in 33. While in the 40s, Dawson meets Billy Graham. And as you might know, Billy had these large events he would do sharing the gospel with thousands of people. And he asked Dawes, he said, Dawes, there's so many people coming to faith. Can you help us follow them up? And Dawson said, no, Billy, we're not into the masses. We're just in the one-on-one, life-to-life, small groups. So he turned Billy down. So Billy comes back to him a second time. He said, Dawes, there's so many people coming to faith, and we need to follow them up. You're the Navigators. Can you help us? And he said, no. So give Billy credit. He comes back to Dawes a third time. He said, Dawes, I'm not even sleeping at night. I'm so concerned about these new Christians. So when Dawson said, you got the wrong guy, Billy reaches over, grabs him by the shoulders and says, who? Who else is majoring in this stuff? Well, after Dawson got the shakes, he's like, all right, Billy, we'll pray about how we might be able to help you. And right after that, Dawson took a trip around the world, and I think it was 48, where he was assessing where different missionaries were going to serve. 46 or 48, somewhere in there. I think it's 46. And he's walking up and down the coast of Formosa, which is now Taiwan. He said, Lord, I haven't even gotten done the work you've given me to get done. How in the world am I going to help Billy? But God told him, you need to help him. Next slide, please. So when he got back from that trip, he arranged for his right-hand man, Lawrence Sanning, to go to the Billy Graham organization for 3 years to work with them. So you'll see Dawes down in this photo, second to the right here. Billy in the top corner. You'll see a few other familiar faces in there. Cliff Barrows.
Which one is Lauren?
You know, Lauren is actually not in this photo. I'm glad you asked. All right, next photo, please. So the Navigators have a rich history between the Billy Graham organization and the Navs. And Astoria Glen is the home of the Navigators. For those, has anybody been to the Glen? I'd encourage you at some point to get to the Glen in Colorado Springs. It's a special place. Billy Graham was originally going to actually buy it himself, was in the process of buying it. And some of his supporters weren't excited about him having a castle in Colorado, so they pushed back, and he ended up getting out of the deal, and the Navigators jumped in. Next slide. So this is a view from the spot where Dawson is buried today, but there's this amazing panorama of the Glen, and I know it's hard to see in this photo, but like there's a castle tucked away in the back. But this is the spot where Dawson went up to just ask God to give us the impossible. He actually claimed 1 Chronicles 29, 10 through 13 for this place. And I try and envision this 70 years ago when Dawson prayed this to the Lord. It's where David's praying in the assembly. And he says, praise be to you, O Lord, God our Father Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor. Everything in heaven and earth, this place, is yours. Yours, O Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. Wealth and honor, key verse, comes from you. You're the ruler of all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt and give strength to all. Now, our God, we give you thanks and praise your glorious name. So he carves into a rock a 1 CR 29, 10 through 13. And just ask God to give us this place. And he says, Lord, if you entrust this all to us, I want to dedicate it now to you, as David did, to be used for your glory, to make known your holy name in all the world. So the asking price was originally $700,000. When the gentleman selling it to us, George Strait, not the singer, Texas Oilman, he said, since Billy's involved, I'd like to drop it to $300,000. And that made the down payment only $112,000. Well, the operating budget of the Navigators in 1953 was $112,000. Well, we had 6 weeks to come up with that $112,000. So Dawson, man of faith, is asking God to do the impossible. So you heard me say 6 weeks. Lawrence Stanley, our second president, would tell you it took them 2 weeks just to figure out what they were going to do, so it was more like 4 weeks. Well, Dawson heads back to California and starts telling the staff about this amazing opportunity. And I just try to envision this today. Staff start selling their cars, start having garage sales, start sending their kids through the neighborhoods to collect coins. Some of our staff who are overseas in Asia were saying, don't even give me my salary this month. Just give it to the purchase of the Glen. So there's this crazy effort going on. And at one point, Dawson's assistant came in to give him the financials of what had come in that day. And when she came in, she found him with his head down on his desk. And when he looked up, he had tears in his eyes. And he said, if this is going to happen, God's going to have to do it because I've done all I can do. Which is a great posture because the update was nothing had come in that day. Well, clock's ticking. 6 weeks is up. And there's $80,000 in the account. That's about 30,000 shy for those math people here. I'm not a math guy. I had to think about it for a minute. Well, would you believe 30,000 shy? What does Dawson do when it's time for the closing? He gets on a plane and heads to Houston. 30,000 shy, believing that God can do it. So he gets down there. There's been some money transferred to a bank, and he goes to get that money, and the bank president heard about this Glenary purchase, and he said, hey, I'd like to cut you a check for $8,000 for that purchase. And Dawson's like, I don't even know if we need that. He said, just take it. Well, by the time Dawson sits down at the table, there's $110,000 sitting in the account. I think I said 112 earlier, sorry. It's 110. So literally everything came in. And they said, Mr. Trotman, we're really sorry. There's some additional fees we hadn't accounted for administration and insurance. We're going to need another $8,000 to close this. So Dawson's like pulling out that check. Boom! That's my interpretation of the moment. But literally, God provided everything at the last moment. And during the closing, George Strait said, Dawes, do you believe in Santa Claus? I'm going to throw in an extra 300 acres if you guys start a camp for kids. So he took him up on that offer, and we started Eagle Lake Camp a few years later. And then as soon as the closing was over, Dawson got on the phone and called Billy. This is what phones used to look like. And he said, told him the good news, and Billy said, God did it. God did it. I knew the Navigators were supposed to have that place all along. All right, next slide. So we show up in 56. This is Dawson with the sweet bomber jacket, and he's brought some of his crew. You'll see Lauren Sandy down the bottom right, kneeling down. You'll see George Strake in the top with a hat on, and his group kind of learning what to turn on, what to not touch at the Glen, and all that kind of fun stuff. All right, next slide. So here's Dawes teaching at a conference in the Great Hall. Next slide. The Glen, Jim would tell you, was quite an experience for the staff that lived there. Just a unique experience. It was a training center where staff would get trained and be sent out all over the world, and they'd have these meals together and these moments together, these prayers together, this training together. And he said it was quite an experience he'll never forget. So, next slide. So here's Dawes and Lila. This is pretty close to 1956. Next slide. As Chip alluded to, Dawson was invited to Word of Life to speak at a conference, and a bunch of people came that day. And this is a fascinating story I've just learned in the last month. So I've had to adjust some of my storytelling because I feel like I've been fine-tuned a little bit from above. So what I'm about to share with you is something Lila herself said that I found on discipleshiplibrary.com. So it's Father's Day weekend, and she's asking the Lord to give her something special for Dawes. Can you go back to the previous slide? She's asking the Lord if he would give her something special to tell Dawes for Father's Day weekend. And the Lord leads her to 2 Kings chapter 2. So by the way, it's fascinating to hear Lila say where she was in the scriptures. And she's spending time in the Word and with the Lord. And the Lord leads her to this section where Elijah and Elisha are walking along, and in here, Elijah's taken up. And as she's reading that, the Lord tells Lila, I'm going to do the same thing with Dawes. So Lila, close the Word. She tells this group she's speaking to, you know how when you get something from the Lord in the scriptures and you just kind of like, that's not the word you wanted, and you close it, and then you kind of open it up, hoping you'll come up to something, you'll get a new word from the Lord. Oh, she's back in 2 Kings chapter 2. She's like, all right, Lord. So she tells Dawes, this was on can't recall if this was on a Saturday. I think she tells him this on a Saturday, what the Lord had told her. He's like, what? The Lord, I'm going home? He's like, when? She's like, soon. He's like, well, let's go pray. So next slide. They go down to the water to pray. And as they're praying, God confirms in Dawes this, and he's like, all right, honey. He pulls out a notebook and hands her this notebook, and he says, I need you to start writing. And he starts sharing, and she starts writing and writing. Well, 17 pages later, she's done. He tells her what's to happen to her family, what's to happen to the Navigators. He actually gives her a 10-year plan of what's going to happen for the Navs. Then he warns her. He warns her about these Christian leaders. He says, you need to watch out for these guys. And the group that she's speaking to, she says, would you believe every one of those warnings he gave me came true? I'd never heard that story. Well, that was on a Saturday. So on Sunday, Jack Wurtson, who you'll see is the director of the camp. He's looking for Dawes, and this is another fascinating part of the story I'd never heard before. When he's looking for Dawes to take a little boat ride, and when he finds Dawes is reading this book, The Power of Prayer, E.M. Bounds. And he's in his car by himself. And when Jack finds him, he's like, Dawes, do you have a wish? As he's reading that book. He said, man, I just want to snuggle up with the heart of God. And then they head to the boat. And they go water skiing, and Dawson's out on the water for quite a bit. Apparently when they got back, Dawson was so tired that he could barely get up the little ladder for the ramp. And then there's this group of young people getting on the boat, heading out for one last ride, and he asked, hey, does anybody not know how to swim? And two girls raised their hand, Floy and Aileen. So he got in the boat and locked arms with those two, and the boat takes off with all these young people. And they're out there on the water, and at some point, Dawson and Jack communicated, and Dawes said, we should go get Lila. He yells it, we should go get Lila. And then Jack turns the boat really hard, really fast. They hit a wake in the water, and Dawson and Aileen go flying out. And on Dawson's left arm, Floyd goes flying down into the boat. So by the time the boat gets back around, they get Aileen in, who Dawson had basically used all the strength he had left to get her in the boat, and that was the moment he drowned. One gal had actually, it's interesting because Betty Skinner was Dawson's assistant for a number of years, and when she went to heaven, all her files came to headquarters, and at some point I was able to look at the testimonies of everybody who was in the boat that day, which is just kind of unbelievable. So I'm reading these accounts of this gal who reached over and grabbed Dawes by the hair, was trying to hold him up, had to let go, wasn't strong enough. Another gal was a lifeguard, jumped in to save him, got double cramps in both her legs, was unable to get to him. And he drowned that day. And when this happened, Lila's in her cabin with her daughter Ruthie. And she hears somebody running. And as they're running up to the cabin, she knew. And the woman said, there's been an accident. And Ruthie says, is Daddy okay? Where's Daddy? And Lila comes out of the cabin, and this woman says, I'm going to go get some ladies together. We're going to pray. And Lila says, you ladies can get together, but you don't need to pray for Dawes. He's already gone. So people were just kind of blown away at Lila's sensitivity to the Holy Spirit leading her and telling her that. Can I see the next slide? So Billy Graham officiated the funeral service for Dawes in the Great Hall. And I'm going to attempt to play something for you. I have no idea if this is going to work. But I want you to hear what Billy had to say. It's only about 40 seconds. He's going to tell the story about meeting Dawes in 1941. So let me see if I can do this.
1941. Johnny Streeter is here today. He introduced me to Dawson. And I remember he put out his big hand, and I was just a freshman. And he said, "Hi, Billy." And he looked me right in the eye, and his eyes pierced me through. But he made me feel like I was the only man on earth. And he said, "Come over here, let's sit down." He said, "I want to share something with you." And he he got out his Bible and he gave me a verse of scripture. And he said, what did the Lord give you in your devotions this morning? Well, I hadn't had my devotions. I hadn't been with him 5 minutes until he was challenging my life and probing to the depths of my life.
That was Billy's first introduction to Dodge. And we're basically out of time. I had another hour's worth I wanted to share with you. But on that note, I just wanted to say that I want to read something to you I've never seen before. And this was something that Billy Graham wrote in a book called The Holy Spirit in 1978. He said, Dawson made me memorize 2 Timothy 2:2. Anybody made you memorize? Where Paul said, the things you've heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will be faithful to teach others. So you see, Billy says, it's like a mathematical formula for spreading the gospel and enlarging the church. Paul taught Timothy. Timothy shared what he knew with faithful. Faithful would teach others. And so the process goes on and on. If every believer followed this pattern, the church would reach the entire world with the gospel in one generation. But here's the part that really got me. This is what I want to leave with you. Mass crusades, those large stadium events where he's sharing the gospel with thousands of people, in which I believe in, in which I've committed my life, will never finish the Great Commission, but a one-by-one ministry will. Let me pray for us.